The rain hit the glass of the diner like a handful of small stones, each drop sharp and steady. Inside, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the faded vinyl booths. Maya sat near the back, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had lost its heat 20 minutes ago. She was 34 years old, wearing a faded canvas jacket that hid the line of her shoulders, her dark hair pulled back into a simple knot at the base of her neck. To anyone passing through the small town of Blackwood, she looked like another drifting soul looking for cheap coffee and a place to rest her eyes. But Maya didn't drift. She moved with a silent, measured grace that only came from 15 years of walking in places where a single loud step meant you didn't come home. For 15 years, she had been a Navy SEAL, serving in specialized units where her existence was reduced to a set of coordinates and a call sign. Now, she was just the new girl in a town that didn't like strangers. Blackwood was a valley town wrapped in high pines and dense fog, the kind of place where families lived for generations and secrets were handed down like old furniture. Maya had bought a small, overgrown property 3 miles outside the main road, hoping the trees would give her the silence she needed to sleep through the night. She wanted a simple life, a life where her hands only held tools, not weapons, and where the loudest sound was the wind through the tall timber. But peace is a luxury that towns like Blackwood rarely offer to outsiders. The locals kept their distance, watching her from behind store windows, whispering about the woman who lived alone at the edge of the woods and never spoke unless spoken to. Maya didn't mind the silence, but she noticed the way people carried themselves, the subtle tension in their shoulders whenever a dark blue patrol car rolled slowly down the main drag. The door to the diner creaked open, sending a chill through the warm room. A man stepped inside, taking off his wide-brimmed hat and shaking the water from the brim. His name was Officer Miller, though everyone called him Marcus. He was a tall man, broad across the chest, with small, heavy-lidded eyes that seemed to scan everything for a flaw he could exploit. For 12 years, Marcus had been the unofficial ruler of Blackwood's roads. The sheriff was old and rarely left the station, leaving Marcus to enforce his own version of the law. He walked past the counter without a word to the waitress, his thick leather boots squeaking on the wet linoleum, and stopped directly in front of Maya's booth. Maya didn't look up immediately. She took a slow breath, letting her lungs fill with the scent of stale coffee and damp wool, grounding herself in the present. She felt the heavy presence above her, the distinct shift in the air that happened when someone was used to taking up more space than they deserved. Marcus leaned down, placing both hands flat on the wooden table, his knuckles pale against the dark grain. He smelled of tobacco and cold rain. He looked at Maya, his expression fixed in a hard, practice-honed scowl meant to break the resolve of teenagers and lost drivers. "You're in my seat, girl," Marcus said, his voice low and raspy, carrying just enough weight to cause the diner's owner to suddenly busy himself with a rag at the far end of the counter. Maya raised her eyes, her gaze flat and clear. She saw the badge pinned to his chest, slightly tarnished at the edges, and the heavy duty belt sagging slightly on his hip. She saw the tension in his forearms and the slight flare of his nostrils. In her mind, the data processed instantly: range, posture, intent, access to gear. It was an instinct trained into her through thousands of hours of combat scenarios, a reflex she had tried hard to bury under the quiet rhythm of her new life. "There aren't any names on the booths, officer," Maya replied, her voice soft, calm, completely void of the tremor Marcus was clearly expecting. Marcus sneered, his lip curling just enough to show his yellowed teeth. He didn't like the tone. He didn't like the lack of fear. In a town like Blackwood, fear was the currency that kept things moving, and this stranger was holding out on him. He took a step closer, crowding the booth, his body blocking the soft light from the hanging lamps above. He rested his right hand on the butt of his sidearm, the leather snap clicking open with a distinct, deliberate sound that echoed through the small space. "Around here, my word is the name on the wall," Marcus murmured, bending down so his face was inches from hers. "You've been in town 3 weeks. You don't buy gas at the local station, you don't talk to the neighbors, and you look at people like you're counting their teeth. I don't like mysterious people in my valley, Mississippi." They usually bring trouble, or they're running from it. Maya slowly uncrossed her legs under the table, shifting her center of gravity slightly forward. Her muscles didn't tense, they relaxed, entering the fluid readiness that precedes immediate action. "I'm just living my life," she said gently. "I paid for my coffee, and I'm going to finish it." The flat response was too much for Marcus's pride. In front of the diner staff and the two regulars sitting near the jukebox, his authority felt challenged. His face flushed a dark red, the veins at his temples swelling under the thin skin. Without warning, his hand blurred. He unholstered his heavy Glock 17, the black steel catching the flickering ceiling light, and in one swift, aggressive motion, he slammed the frame of the weapon against the wooden table before raising the muzzle until it rested firmly against the side of Maya's forehead. The metal was cold against her skin, right on the temporal bone. A collective gasp rose from the back of the diner, followed by the immediate, terrified stillness of people who knew better than to move. "You think you're clever?" Marcus hissed, his finger lying flat along the frame, just above the trigger guard, though his knuckles were tight. "I could pull this trigger right now, report that an unidentified female reached for my belt, and nobody in this county would ask a single question. You don't have a name here. You don't have anyone to miss you." Maya's eyes didn't flicker. Her pulse didn't spike, in fact, her heart rate dropped into the slow, steady rhythm reserved for extreme close-quarter survival. To Marcus, she was a helpless local woman intimidated into silence. He was entirely unaware that the woman he was holding at gunpoint had survived ambushes in mountain passes, led high-risk extraction teams through burning compound grounds, and mastered hand-to-hand combat systems designed to neutralize threats in less time than it takes to draw a breath. She knew the weight of his gun, the mechanical play of its trigger, and the precise angle required to strip it from his grip and break his wrist in 3 distinct places. "Take the gun off my head, officer," Maya said. Her voice wasn't raised. It was flat, cold, and stripped of all human warmth, a tone that belonged to a shadow, not a civilian sitting in a greasy spoon. Marcus laughed, a short, harsh sound that lacked real humor. "Or what? What are you gonna do about it, little girl?" Maya stared straight into his eyes. In that moment, Marcus saw something shift in the dark irises across from him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't terror. It was a complete, chilling absence of fear, replaced by a calculating silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. For a fraction of a second, a small voice inside his head told him to step back, to put the gun away, to walk out the door and never look at this woman again. But his ego was too large, his control over this town too absolute, to listen to the whisper of intuition. Instead of pulling the trigger or backing down, Marcus leaned in further, grinding the barrel slightly into her skin. "I'm giving you till the count of 3 to get out of this booth, get in your car, and leave Blackwood for good. 1. Before he could utter the word 2, Maya's left hand moved. It was not a fast swing or a frantic grab, it was an economy of movement refined over 15 years of Black Ops warfare. Her palm struck the underside of his wrist, deflecting the muzzle upward away from her head just as her right hand swept across, clamping down on the slide of the pistol. In the same continuous, fluid motion, she rose from the booth, driving her thumb hard into the nerve cluster behind his wrist while rotating her hips. The gun came out of Marcus's hand with a sharp snap that echoed like a dry branch snapping in the frost. He didn't even have time to yell before Maya reversed the lever of his own weapon against his thumb, dislocating it with a soft pop, and swept his forward foot out from under him. Marcus hit the wet linoleum floor with a heavy thud, his wind knocked completely out of him, his hat rolling away under a nearby table. Before he could recover his breath, Maya was over him. She racked the slide of the Glock, ejecting a live 9mm round that clattered against the floor, and brought the weapon to bear directly on the bridge of Marcus's nose. The diner was dead silent. The rain outside seemed to quiet down, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of the officer lying flat on his back, staring up at the muzzle of his own sidearm held by a woman he had assumed was defenseless. "Safety's off," Maya said quietly, her voice dropping into that smooth, terrifying register. Your index finger was resting on the slide, not the frame. Your footwork was sloppy. Your grip was weak. If I were an actual threat, Marcus, you would be dead before your hat hit the floor. Marcus stared at her, his eyes wide, his chest heaving as he tried to pull air into his bruised lungs. The pain in his wrist was sharp and throbbing, but the cold realization in his chest was far worse. He looked at the way she held the weapon, the precise, professional posture, the lack of tremor in her fingers, the absolute focus in her dark eyes. This was not a scared civilian. This was a predator who had spent her life around steel and powder. Who the hell are you? Marcus managed to choke out, his confidence completely shattered into jagged fragments. Maya didn't answer right away. She slowly lowered the weapon, performed a swift one-handed magazine release, caught the magazine in the air, and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency. She dropped the empty pistol onto his chest, followed by the loose round and the full magazine. I'm someone who came here for peace, Maya said, taking a step back and buttoning her canvas jacket. And I suggest you leave me to it. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heavy boots making no sound on the wet floor. The diner patrons shrank back as she passed, looking at her with a mixture of awe and terror. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the pouring rain, leaving Marcus lying on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered authority. As Maya walked to her old truck, the cool water soaking through her hair, she felt the old familiar heaviness returning to her chest. She had wanted to hide from the violence, to leave the combat boots and tactical gear in the past, buried under the dark soil of her quiet property. But as she started the engine and watched the wipers clear the foggy windshield, she realized something that she had tried to deny since the day she received her discharge papers: you can leave the war behind, but the war never really leaves you. And in a town like Blackwood, where power was misused and the weak were silenced, a ghost with specialized training was the last thing the corrupt men in charge were prepared to face. Maya drove slowly down the main road, the headlights cutting through the thick mountain mist. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the red and blue lights of another patrol car flashing near the end of the street. She knew this wasn't over. Marcus wouldn't accept the humiliation. He would call his sheriff, he would spin a story, and he would come after her with everything the small town's law enforcement could muster. Maya sighed, resting her hands on the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the black plastic. She didn't want a war in these peaceful woods, but as she looked out at the dark trees lining the road, her military instincts kicked in, mapping the terrain, calculating escape routes, and identifying defensive positions. If they wanted to test her resolve, they were about to learn that some people were meant to be left alone. The local police force was small, consisting of only 6 officers, but they had controlled Blackwood for over 2 decades without any real interference from county officials or state troopers. Sheriff Vance, an older man with a thick neck and a mean streak that had only grown with age, ran the department like his own personal enforcement agency. The town sat on a key route between 2 major highways, making it a convenient corridor for illicit transport, something Vance and his small crew had been quietly profiting from for years. When Marcus dragged himself back to the station, his wrist swollen and his gun disassembled in his hands, Sheriff Vance didn't laugh. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar, listening to Marcus's frantic, embarrassed account of what had happened at the diner. Vance was a shrewd man. He knew that a normal woman, no matter how angry, didn't disarm a trained officer in less than 2 seconds without formal instruction. She stripped your gear, broke your finger, and left you on the floor? Vance asked, his voice low and heavy like gravel sliding down a chute. She was fast, Chief, Marcus stammered, holding his bandaged wrist against his ribs. It wasn't normal. She held that Glock like she was born with it. She talked to me like I was a recruit on a training field. Vance slowly took the cigar out of his mouth and leaned forward, his heavy hands resting on the desk. I ran her plates when she bought that cabin 3 weeks ago. Name's Maya Lin. Background check came back almost entirely blank. No criminal record, no credit history before 10 years ago, no social security activity for 15 years straight. Just a discharge paper from the Department of the Navy listed as administrative separation. Marcus blinked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Navy? You think she was a clerk or something? Clerks don't disarm 6-foot cops in 5 seconds, you idiot, Vance barked, slamming his fist onto the desk. She was special operations. The kind of people the government hires when they want a job done without leaving any paperwork behind. And now she's sitting on 50 acres of land right above our northern transport route. Vance stood up, pulling his wide leather belt tight around his belly. He didn't care about Marcus's hurt pride, but he cared deeply about the shipment coming through the valley tomorrow night. A former military operator living half a mile from their primary drop zone was a variable he couldn't afford to ignore. If she was retired, she might just be looking for peace. But if she noticed the late-night truck activity on the back roads, or if Marcus's foolishness had made her suspicious, she could become a major problem. And Vance didn't like problems he couldn't control. Take Johnson and Miller, Vance ordered, pointing a thick finger at Marcus. Go out to her property tonight. Don't go in with guns blazing, we don't need state police looking into a dead veteran on day one. Just show her that this town belongs to us. Burn her shed, cut her power lines, let her know that if she doesn't pack her bags by sunrise, the next thing that burns will be her cabin while she's inside it. Meanwhile, back at her small wooden cabin, Maya was sitting on a plain wooden chair near the dark window. She hadn't turned on the lights. The house was cold, but she was used to the cold. In her hands, she held a small metal box that she kept hidden beneath the floorboards of her bedroom closet. Inside were her service medals, a bronze star with a combat V, a purple heart, and a simple, heavy trident insignia that marked her as a member of the elite SEAL teams. Beside the medals was a single photograph, faded at the edges, showing Maya standing beside 3 other operators in the dusty sunlight of an airfield halfway around the world. She looked at the faces in the photo, her team, her family. 2 of them had never made it back from that final deployment in the mountains, and the third was living in a specialized care facility in San Diego, unable to speak or walk. Maya was the only one left who could move freely, the only one who carried the full weight of their shared memories. When she had left the service, she felt like a ghost who had survived her own funeral. She had moved from town to town, seeking a place where the noise in her mind would fade into the background. She thought she had found it here, in these damp, green hills of the Pacific Northwest. A faint sound outside snapped her out of her thoughts. It was the sound of tires rolling slowly over wet gravel, turning off the main road a quarter mile down the track. Maya placed the medals back in the box, closed the lid, and slid it into her jacket pocket. She didn't feel fear, she felt a cold, familiar calm settle over her bones, the same calm she had felt before stepping out of a helicopter into absolute darkness. She walked quietly to the back door, picking up a heavy flashlight and a long steel pry bar she used for clearing overgrown brush. Through the window, she watched 3 figures moving through the trees under the shadow of the heavy pine canopy. They were carrying flashlights, but they held them low, trying to hide their approach. One of them had a jerrycan of gasoline, its distinct smell wafting up through the damp night air toward her porch. Sloppy, Maya whispered to herself. They were moving like men who had never faced an opponent who fought back. They assumed that because she was a lone woman in an isolated cabin, she would be huddled in her bed, praying they would go away. They didn't understand that to Maya, these woods weren't a dark, scary place, they were a tactical environment she had already mapped in her head during her morning runs. She stepped out into the damp night air, slipping around the side of the wooden shed before the 3 men reached the perimeter of her yard. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, hanging in the air like a white veil. Spread out, Marcus's voice hissed from the tree-line. He was wearing his coat, his wrist wrapped in a tight white brace. Set the fire near the back of the woodpile. Make sure it takes. Are you sure about this, Marcus? Another officer whispered nervously. Vance said just scare her. This is how we scare her. Marcus snapped. Now move. Before the man with the fuel can could reach the woodpile, a shadow detached itself from the side of the shed. Maya didn't call out a warning. She stepped into the man's path, swinging the steel pry bar with precise control, striking the gas can out of his hands with a loud metallic clatter. The man gasped, dropping to his knees as Maya's hand shot forward, grabbing his collar and driving him into the damp soil with a swift leg sweep. "One down," Maya said quietly. The second officer, Johnson, turned his flashlight toward the sound, the bright beam illuminating Maya standing over his fallen partner. Shock paralyzed him for a second too long. Maya closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, using the butt of her flashlight to strike his collarbone before he could unholster his sidearm. He groaned, dropping his weapon into the wet leaves as his shoulder went numb. Marcus heard the struggle and whirled around, drawing his gun with his left hand, his aim wild and shaky in the dark. "Get back! Stay back!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Maya stepped into the shadow of a large pine tree, completely vanishing from his line of sight. Marcus swung his flashlight frantically from side to side, the beam cutting through the fog, showing only wet trunks and hanging moss. "I know you're out there," Marcus shouted, his breathing short and ragged. "You can't win this. Vance runs this county. We have the law on our side." "You don't know what the law is," Maya's voice echoed from the trees, sounding like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You think a badge gives you the right to treat people like prey. You think because you wear a uniform, you're strong. But strength isn't about power, Marcus. It's about discipline. And you have none." Marcus fired a shot into the darkness, a blind, panicky pull of the trigger that shattered a low branch 10 feet to Maya's left. The loud crack echoed through the mountains, scaring a flock of roosting birds into the foggy night sky. Before he could pull the trigger a second time, Maya emerged from behind him. She seized his left arm, twisting it back until his shoulder joint clicked sharply, forcing him to drop the weapon. She didn't break his bone this time, she simply pinned him against the rough bark of the pine tree, her forearm pressed hard against his throat, holding him suspended just off his feet. Marcus choked, his legs kicking uselessly at the air. He looked into her eyes, illuminated by the beam of his own dropped flashlight lying on the ground. In the dim light, he saw no anger, no hatred, only an overwhelming, absolute authority that made him feel tiny and utterly defenseless. "I gave you a chance in the diner," Maya said softly, her breath forming small white clouds in the cold air. "I let you walk away with your life and your dignity. But you came to my home. You brought fire to my land. You have stepped over a line that you cannot cross back from. Please." Marcus gasped, his pride completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "Please, don't kill me." "I'm not going to kill you," Maya said, her voice dropping into a register that chilled him to the marrow. "Because death is easy. Live with what you are, Marcus. Go back to your sheriff. Tell him that if he wants me off this land, he needs to come himself. And tell him to bring everyone he has. Because I am done running." She released her grip, and Marcus collapsed onto the wet needles, coughing violently, clutching his throat with his good hand. Maya didn't wait for him to stand up. She gathered their dropped weapons, cleared the chambers, and tossed the empty frames into the thick brush where they wouldn't be found until daylight. Then she turned her back on them and walked back to her cabin, leaving the 3 officers broken and terrified in the dark. Inside her home, Maya sat down at the table once more. The room was quiet again, but the peace was gone. She knew that Sheriff Vance wouldn't back down now. A public defeat at the hands of a single woman would destroy his grip on the valley. He would mobilize everything he had, not to scare her, but to eliminate her completely. Maya pulled her metal box out once more, setting the navy trident on the wooden surface in front of her. She looked at it for a long time, feeling the rough weight of her past pressing against her present. For years, she had tried to distance herself from the warrior she had been, believing that her military skills were a curse that brought only pain and isolation. But as she looked around her simple, quiet cabin, she realized that those skills weren't a curse, they were a tool, given to her so she could stand between the weak and those who wished to crush them. She stood up, walked to her closet, and pulled out an old black canvas duffel bag that she hadn't opened since leaving the service. Inside were her tactical clothes, robust boots, multi-tools, radio scanners, and several high-grade medical kits, the standard gear of an operator who was always prepared for the worst. She laid the items out on the bed with practiced precision, checking every buckle, every strap, every tool. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the tall pine trees outside, Maya stood by the window, her silhouette sharp and dark against the cold gray light. The new girl in Blackwood was gone. In her place stood a veteran of 15 years of shadow warfare, prepared to defend her ground against an army of corrupt men who thought they owned the world. By mid-morning, word of the incident at Maya's property had spread through the law enforcement network in the valley. Sheriff Vance was furious. His office was a mess of crumpled paper and cold coffee cups as he paced back and forth behind his desk. Marcus sat in the corner, his broken wrist wrapped tightly, his face pale and sunken. The other two officers refused to go back to the property without heavy backup, claiming that the woman moved like a phantom through the thick timber. "She's one woman," Vance roared, slamming his heavy hand onto the desk, rattling the pens and ashtrays. "You three had guns, you had the element of surprise, and she sent you back like whipped dogs." "Sheriff, you don't understand," Johnson stammered, his arm in a sling from his dislocated shoulder. "She isn't normal. She took us down in the dark without even using a gun. She knew where we were before we even reached the clearing. If we go back there with just a few guys, someone is going to end up dead." Vance stopped pacing and looked out the window at the misty main street of Blackwood. He knew that if this got out to the townspeople, his authority would be gone overnight. The locals had been quiet for years out of fear, but fear is a fragile thing. Once people see that their oppressors can be defeated, courage spreads like wildfire. Furthermore, his major contraband transport was scheduled for 8 o'clock that evening. $250,000 worth of illegal cargo was coming through the northern pass, and he couldn't afford any disruptions. "We aren't going to play games anymore," Vance said, his voice dropping into a harsh, cruel whisper. "Call in Miller, Davis, and the State Reserve guys who take our payroll. Tell them to bring the tactical gear from the armory. We're going to set up a perimeter around her cabin. We'll cut her water, we'll cut her phone lines, and when the sun goes down, we burn the whole place to the ground. If she tries to run, shoot to kill. We'll claim she was an armed trespasser who resisted arrest." While Vance was organizing his men, Maya was not waiting passively in her cabin. She knew the basic principles of defense: a static position is a death trap. If you stay in one spot, your enemy can surround you, cut off your supplies, and dictate the terms of the engagement. To win against a superior force, you must remain mobile, dictate the tempo, and use the terrain to your advantage. Maya left her cabin around noon, slipping into the dense forest surrounding her property. She carried only her tactical backpack, a water filtration unit, a medical kit, and a short, heavy hunting knife she had purchased at a local hardware store. She spent the next 4 hours surveying the woods, setting up non-lethal deterrents along the primary approach paths. She used thick vines, fallen branches, and natural drop-offs to create a series of subtle traps designed to disorient and delay any group moving through the trees. As she worked, she observed the town from a high ridge overlooking the valley. She could see the police station, the main street, and the small, rusted bridge that served as the only entry point from the highway. She saw the extra patrol cars pulling into the police lot, saw men in heavy tactical vests loading gear into the trunks of their vehicles. From her high vantage point, Maya noticed something else: a large, unmarked box truck parked behind the station, surrounded by several men who didn't look like police officers. They were dressed in plain clothes, carrying heavy duffel bags, and talking animatedly with Sheriff Vance. Maya realized that this wasn't just about a cop's hurt pride at a diner. There was something much larger happening in Blackwood. The sheriff wasn't just a bully, he was running an organized illegal operation using his police authority as a cover. That was why he couldn't let her stay. An experienced outsider, especially one with military background, was a direct threat to his entire enterprise. It's never just a simple town, Maya murmured to herself, watching the men through her small tactical binoculars. There's always a deeper rot. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky had turned a dark, bruised purple. A thick, heavy fog began to roll down from the mountains, coating the forest floor in a layer of white mist that reduced visibility to less than 20 feet. It was the perfect cover for an attack, and the perfect cover for a counter-offensive. Sheriff Vance led his team of 8 men up the mountain road in 3 separate vehicles. They parked half a mile from Maya's cabin, stepping out into the cold night air with heavy shotguns and tactical rifles. They were dressed in full riot gear, their faces hidden behind dark helmets and visors. They looked like a military force, but they lacked the discipline and coordination that true training provides. They talked loudly, slammed their car doors, and moved through the brush with heavy, clumsy steps. "Form a sweep line," Vance ordered through his shoulder radio, his voice crackling with static. "Keep 5 yards between each man. Push her toward the clearing. If you see movement, don't wait for my command, open fire." The men spread out into the fog, their heavy boots crunching on the wet leaves. Maya watched them from 20 feet above the ground, perched silently in the fork of a massive fir tree. She wore dark gray clothing that blended seamlessly with the wet bark and dark foliage. She watched the sweep line move beneath her, identifying the weaknesses in their formation instantly. They were looking straight ahead, focusing only on eye-level movements, completely. As the man on the far left of the line passed beneath her branch, Maya slid down the trunk with silent precision, landing behind him without making a sound. She reached out, wrapped her arm around his neck, and applied precise pressure to his carotid artery. In less than 5 seconds, the man went limp in her arms. She caught his rifle before it hit the ground, lowered him gently into the ferns, and vanished back into the mist before the man next to him even noticed he was missing. 5 minutes later, the second man on the flank noticed the gap in their line. "Davis," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Davis, where are you?" There was no answer, only the steady dripping of wet pine needles. "Sheriff, Davis isn't responding," the officer reported into his radio, his breath visible in the beam of his light. "Keep moving." Vance's voice snapped back. "He probably fell in a ditch. Don't lose focus." The officer took 3 more steps forward when a shadow stepped out from behind a large rock directly in front of him. Before he could raise his shotgun, Maya struck the barrel upward, driving the heel of her hand into his chin. The officer stumbled backward, his visor cracking against the rock face behind him, and sank to his knees, completely disoriented. Maya stripped his tactical radio and his sidearm, disarming the weapon with a quick movement of her thumb, and vanished into the fog once more. Panic began to spread through the remaining officers. One by one, the outer edges of their formation were disappearing into the dark forest. They weren't being shot, they were simply vanishing, leaving behind dropped flashlights and quiet radios. "Vance. We're losing guys out here." Marcus panicked over the radio from his position near the rear. "She's in the mist. She's everywhere. Shut up and hold your ground." Vance screamed, his voice filled with rage and mounting fear. He was in the center of the line, holding a heavy pump-action shotgun, his eyes darting frantically from side to side. "She's just one woman. Find her." Suddenly, the night was pierced by a sharp, high-pitched squeal. Maya had taken one of the captured police radios, held it near her microphone, and activated a high-frequency feedback loop, filling the officers' earpieces with a deafening noise. The men dropped their weapons to cover their ears, groaning in pain as the sound echoed through their headsets. Maya took advantage of the chaos. She moved through the disoriented group like a winter wind, striking precision blows to their limbs and bodies, neutralizing 3 more officers in less than 30 seconds. They fell into the wet moss, their gear clattering uselessly against the stones. When the feedback finally stopped, only Sheriff Vance and Marcus were left standing in the small clearing 50 feet from Maya's dark cabin. The other 6 officers were scattered through the woods, unconscious or unable to stand. Vance stood in the center of the path, his chest heaving, his shotgun held tight against his shoulder. His sweat was cold on his forehead, mixing with the damp mist. He looked around at the silent woods, realizing for the first time the true scale of the mistake he had made. This was not a civilian he could intimidate with a badge and a loud voice. This was a master of war, operating in her natural element. "Come out!" Vance yelled into the fog, his voice shaking with anger and terror. "Come out and face me like a man." A lone figure stepped out of the mist 20 feet in front of him. Maya walked slowly, her hands empty, her stance relaxed. Her dark hair was wet from the rain, clinging to her forehead, but her gaze was steady and unyielding. "I gave you every chance to walk away, Sheriff," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly through the damp silence. "You brought 8 armed men to my home to murder me in the dark. Is this what you call law enforcement in Blackwood?" Vance raised his shotgun, aiming directly at her chest. "I run this town. I decide who lives and who leaves. You're nothing here. Just a ghost from a war nobody cares about." Maya didn't flinch. She took one step forward, closing the distance between them. "You think you're powerful because you have a gun and a title. But real power comes from sacrifice. I spent 15 years watching good people give their lives for something bigger than themselves. You spent 15 years stealing from your own neighbors and hiding behind a piece of brass." Vance's finger tightened on the trigger. "This ends now." Before he could pull the trigger, a loud, sharp snap echoed from the ridge above them, followed by the blinding white light of a military-grade illumination flare bursting overhead. The dark forest was instantly lit up like midday, casting harsh, jagged shadows across the trees. Vance blinked, blinded by the sudden light. In that split second of distraction, Maya moved. She closed the remaining distance with explosive speed, driving her shoulder into Vance's chest, knocking the heavy man off his feet and sending his shotgun flying into the brush. Vance hit the ground hard, rolling onto his back, gasping for air. Maya stood over him, holding his own heavy sidearm pointed directly at his forehead. "It's over, Vance," Maya said softly, her voice calm amidst the fading light of the flare. From the tree line behind her, several figures in dark uniforms stepped out into the clearing. But they weren't Vance's men. They wore the crisp dark blue dress uniforms and dark vests of the State Police Special Investigations Unit, accompanied by federal agents carrying tactical rifles. At the head of the federal squad was a tall woman in a trench coat, holding an official badge identification card out in front of her. "Sheriff Vance, put your hands on your head," the lead agent commanded. "State Police and Federal Narcotics Task Force. You are under arrest for extortion, drug trafficking, and conspiracy." Vance lay on the ground, his eyes wide in absolute shock, looking back and forth between Maya and the federal agents surrounding him. What is this? Who called you?" The lead agent walked up next to Maya, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "She did, Vance. 3 hours ago, she used an encrypted military relay to contact our regional office. She didn't just defend her home, she gave us the exact coordinates, logistics, and timing for your major contraband transport coming through the northern pass tonight. Our team seized the truck 20 minutes ago." Vance looked up at Maya, his mouth open, completely broken. You set this up?" Maya looked down at the fallen sheriff, her face expressionless. "I told you I came here for peace, Vance. But peace isn't just the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of justice. And as long as men like you run this valley, nobody here will ever be peaceful." The state troopers stepped forward, pulling Vance to his feet and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Marcus was dragged out of the brush by 2 other agents, his head hanging low, his spirit entirely broken. One by one, the corrupt officers of Blackwood were led away down the mountain path, their reign of terror finally at an end. The lead agent, whose badge read Agent Miller, turned to Maya as the rain began to fall gently once more through the high trees. "We've been building a case against Vance for 18 months, Miss Lynn," Agent Miller said, her tone filled with deep respect. "But he had the local courts locked down. We couldn't get anyone to testify, and we couldn't get close enough to his operation without him being tipped off. You did in one night what our entire task force couldn't do in a year." "I just wanted them off my land," Maya said quietly, looking down at her hands. "You did more than that," Miller replied. "You saved this town. I looked up your record when your signal came through. 15 years. Bronze Star, Navy Cross recommendation. You served your country well, Maya. But tonight, you served these people." Maya was silent for a long moment, watching the red and blue flashing lights of the state police cruisers winding their way down the mountain road, carrying away the men who had terrorized Blackwood for so long. "The war is over, Agent Miller," Maya murmured, her voice soft against the sound of the rain. "I just want to live my life." "And you can," Miller said, reaching into her pocket and handing Maya an official card. "The county will take over local law enforcement starting tomorrow morning. You won't be bothered again. If you ever need anything at all, you call me directly." Maya accepted the card, putting it into her jacket pocket next to her service medals. She watched as the vehicles disappeared down the mountain, until the forest was quiet once again. The sun began to rise over the mountains 3 hours later, casting warm golden light through the wet pine needles, burning away the lingering mist that had covered the valley for so long. For the first time in 3 weeks, the forest around Maya's cabin didn't feel hostile or cold. It felt quiet, clean, and still. Maya walked back to her front porch, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She sat down on the top step, resting her hands on her knees, watching the birds flutter between the high branches of the fir trees. The heavy burden she had carried for so many years, the weight of her training, the ghosts of her past, the constant readiness for violence, seemed a little lighter in the morning sun. She realized then that her training wasn't a mark of destruction. It was a shield. It was the reason she was able to stand when others were forced to bow, the reason she could protect a town that didn't even know she was fighting for them. 2 days later, Maya walked down the main street of Blackwood. The town looked different in the daylight. The store owners were standing on the sidewalks, talking openly to one another, the heavy veil of fear that had hung over the street gone. As Maya passed the local grocery store, the old shopkeeper stepped out onto the wooden porch, holding a small paper bag of fresh apples. He didn't say anything about the diner, or the cops, or the state police vans that had flooded the town 2 nights ago. He simply looked into Maya's eyes, smiled gently, and handed her the bag. "Good morning, Miss Lynn," the old man said softly. "It's a nice day for a walk." Maya took the bag, feeling the cool, smooth skin of the fruit in her hand. For the first time since she had left the military, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Yes, it is," Maya replied, her voice warm and steady. "It's a very nice day." She continued walking down the street, her posture straight, her step light and confident. She was no longer just the new girl in town, and she was no longer a ghost running from her past. She was a guardian who had found her home, not by hiding from the world, but by standing firm when the darkness tried to push her away. True strength is never found in the weapon you carry or the authority you claim, but in the quiet courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves.